like our Singapore stories.
In theatre, we've been familiar for many years now with this tension. There are those pieces that have tried to engage with certain events in our history from a perspective that might be slightly different than the official perspective, and invariably there's a little bit of tension with the government on that. But the way I see it is, that's their job to be a little bit sensitive and girly about it. They don't like perhaps sometimes when art is critical or takes a different viewpoint. They're entitled to their view, but what I would say sort of to the audience is then it's the audience's job, I think, to support and to be willing to stand up for a plurality of views in Singapore. I'd like to think that there is some audience out there that's prepared to do that. Certainly, I think Singapore theatre would not have survived these many years and be thriving if it were not for the fact that quite apart from those who go for the pantomimes, which is not what we're looking at, there's also a strong, willing, open group of people who are ready to come and support other sorts of pieces that look at the Singapore experience in its many facets, it seems to me.
Yeah, I published the book in 2015. With some help from the government. I got a grant from the government, and when it was published, the grant was withdrawn, taken back, right? Because they said the book had the potential to undermine the government. So, but the book was then picked up by Pantheon, New York. It belongs to Random House, and the book has gone on to sell, thousands and thousands of copies. We've sold nearly 15,000 copies in Singapore. Sold about 8,000 in the US. It's been translated into French, Italian, and the Spanish version came out last month.
If you're a writer, you're a playwright, you write poetry, you want to tell, as I said, the universe of readers, the people, and the universe of the people who sort of like link with you. And if we sort of like, do we have to be specifically Singaporean, or is there a universal message? And look at good old Charlie Chan. Did it sell because of its politics, or is there a universal message, or what?
Well, I mean, the way you ask that question is as if these things are opposed to each other in some way. My view is that some of the best work that has that takes up and attracts a universal or a larger audience is work that is often very specific and I don't want to use the word local, but it's very specific, right? It may be about a specific culture, a specific time, a specific imagining of a future world, but it is precisely because of that specificity that the universal is able to shine through in a genuine way. Rather than, I think, sometimes this idea that in order to reach an international audience, it's necessary for us to somehow delocalize and generalize what we're writing so that we have, a story that's set in some generic Asian exotic locale. We don't even know exactly where it is, but some Asian type story happens, and that's somehow supposed to attract an international audience. If you look around the world, right, if you ask yourself, for example, I'm a big follower of some of these Nordic TV series, right? They've sort of they suddenly come on the scene in the last 5 to 10 years. They're intensely Scandinavian, they're very Swedish, they were obviously written first and foremost for a local audience, but they still nevertheless manage to reach outside of themselves. And if you actually look all around, the French books that you read are intensely French. Those are the ones that make it outside, right? So I think that it's a false dichotomy that you're asking here about sort of, if you write something very specific to Singapore, that somehow it becomes not international or not global. I would almost argue the other way around. At the same time, don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that just because you're a Singapore associated writer of some sort, you must write Singaporean. That I don't believe that at all. Write whatever you know, write whatever you feel strongly about in a specific way. It doesn't have to be about Singapore, but the reality is for many of us, Singapore will be where we have our knowledge and our understanding, and we will write about Singapore. And I think if we write about Singapore well, not only will our fellow Singaporeans appreciate, I would hope, but also some of that work will also garner a larger audience. You know, Margaret, we were sort of there at the dawn of the sort of English, the current sort of English language theatre.
Oh, do I know that?
Yes, and you recall how it was, right? There was a time when perhaps there were not that many people writing about Singapore, so English language theatre would take foreign work and then would try and adapt it a little bit into, and give it a slight Singapore spin.
Well, they gave, yeah.
But then a group of sort of a wave of young Singapore writers started writing stories that were actually situated in Singapore, and the audience really took off and actually has never looked back. I mean, Singapore theatre has gone through its ups and downs in the intervening 30 years or so, but today it's alive, it's healthy, it's got many different strands to it. It continues to produce the so-called foreign work and adapt that to Singapore. But there are many local works being written that slide across different types of genre, and the audiences come. There may be some productions where smaller audience comes, maybe the work is a little less accessible, but there's plenty of work where audiences will come for 3 weeks of 3 weeks of a production. That's a nice, strong, healthy audience. I think Singaporeans are interested in seeing their own stories.
My point is that we do not talk about whether there's Singapore theatre, because there is.
Yes.
Just like you. In literature, there are so many Singapore stories. Of course there is. Every society, every country in the world has stories and things happening, And maybe Singaporeans didn't write about it in the last 10 years, but in the last recent 5, 6, maybe even 10 years, a lot of young people are writing. There are lots of stories being written. There are lots of short stories, novels being written. They're being published. They're not being discovered. They're not being bought as much as they should. But there are many stories.
So we shouldn't box it up. In other words, and commodify it. This notion of a Singapore story, right?
There are lots of young people in Singapore now writing. They're writing great stories, and stories are being published by many publishers in Singapore. I wish Singaporeans would go out and read them and buy them. They are wonderful stories written by people now who are trained in writing. A lot of these young people go out and they have degrees in creative writing. They have a BFA, they have MFA. They've gone and they've trained.
And why are people not reading them?
I don't know. It's a whole system. It's in schools we are not encouraged to read literature.
Isn't that really painful?
There's not enough publicity in the local press and media. We don't have anybody on popular TV encouraging people to read books like you have in America. Talk show host says, read this book, read that book. And we also have competition from the international publishers, right? Because we read in English, and so the English books from America and from UK, they come in and but everybody, most people in the world want to read about themselves. If you go to Paris, the best-selling book in Paris would be a French book. If you go to Berlin, the best-selling book would be a German book.
Didn't we just have a book festival on Sing literature?
Yeah. Let me finish. So if you go to Australia, even if it's an English-speaking country, very likely that the best-selling book would be an Australian writer. Now you have the occasional international blockbusters like Harry Potter, 50 Shades of Grey that are best-selling, that are bestsellers everywhere around the world. Okay?
Right.
But apart from those, most best-selling books would be books written by people of the country.
Yes.
Now it's only in Singapore that we don't have that. If you look at the best-selling books in Kino or in the bookshop, you'll find that they tend to be foreign books. in English, written in English, but foreign books.
And that's our own fault that we're not having the book.
Well, I'm not sure
Yeah,
I'd say
yeah,
fault,
so-
right? But one word that has sort of gone around, I think, a few times here is own, right? Like, do we own it? And I would make the argument that part of ownership is investment. And I'm not talking about the government because I don't care whether the government invests or not. But I think we as a people, if we believe in our art and the need for our own stories, we have to be ready to invest. And we have to be willing to invest more than anyone else will. And this leads to a slight conundrum because I know everyone always says, oh, you know, you shouldn't expect your local art to be of so-called lower quality than international art. So let's say I've got a local movie versus an international movie. People should go for the international movie because it is exclamation, in quotation marks, better, right? But I think what people are forgetting is that when you have an imported work, the R&D investment has already been paid. I lived in New York for many years. I know that of the shows that make it to Broadway, they are a tiny percentage. Meanwhile, there are lots of horrible stuff that gets done day in, day out, off Broadway, off regional theatre. Who is paying for all of those so that at the end there is a community, there is a ecosystem from which the very best work can come up? It's Americans. They're paying and investing in their own art. I think in our bid in this very Singaporean way of we only buy the best, right, which has been inculcated in many of us, we have forgotten that there are some
that you need to grow
we
things.
need to grow ourselves and we need to pay
grow.
for it. Now, if that means going to watch quite a few not so good Singapore theatre pieces because writers have to get better from practice, and even the best writer out of 5 pieces, maybe 1 will be amazing, the other 4 will not be so good, and I'm talking about experienced writers, because actors need to have practice, because just generally we need to build a big enough economy so that you can have the very, very good pieces come out of it. That cost has to be paid by us as a people. If we're prepared to do so, I think that there is more than enough talent here to invest in. If we haven't been doing that, and if perhaps our leaders haven't been the most forthcoming in helping us to see that we need to do that, we need to wake up and do it soon, because if we don't, and we don't invest, then after a while, it atrophies, and there is a risk. I'm not saying it will certainly happen, but there's a risk that we will start losing our own voice and our own stories.
Oh,
and that
Ellen,
would be a very sad thing.
Eleanor, you just spoke to my heart.
Theatre has it slightly easier because we're physically tangible. So in a sense, if you are living in Singapore, you can't really watch New York theatre. You can you're kind of channel a little bit to Singapore theatre. The ones I worry about are those where it's very easy to sort of import the foreign experience. We have to intentionally invest in our writers, in our movie makers, our TV.
Why people may not be consuming our own culture.
Right.
Edmund touched on it already, which is, I think, the idea that English, I think it didn't come to us first as our tongue. It came in through the British. So what happens is you have a crazy first movers advantage, basically. In terms of content generation, the novel as a form was perfected in the 18th century, right? So then you have the marketing and sales. Hollywood is just crazy.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. It's good.
Yes, and then you have like sales retail. We are basically just like sucking in the dirt at the moment. So it's very difficult. So what Eleanor says is true. You have to consciously invest and build up. And unfortunately, the whole climate of the world, this thing about protectionism being
Yeah.
So it all adds up. To be honest, I think the government has invested through the National Arts Council and all, but you can't depend on grants, because works that are likely to get people on their toes, they cannot be taking government grants, because the government will shut you up. That's their prerogative.
That's what Kopal Kun said.
Yeah,
in
so
Australia.
we don't depend on the government for works that cannot depend on their censorship. So we shouldn't. But the fact is that we should not also take away any possible source of patronage, because that's just silly, I think. But we have to be savvy, and I think the government has to also sometimes turn a blind eye. If you want your art world to flourish, you have to allow the artists to do what they want. Don't fund it, it's fine, but let it happen.
We have writers, we have artists, we have very talented people here who are making art, and we have fellow citizens, residents, people in this community, and I think we should support each other in that art making. I think another thing that is important is to grow some kind of the support industry, you know. So I think of this as the academics who teach the art, who write about the art, who have enough of the journalists who have enough of institutional history, so that when they see a new local piece come up, they can compare it to what has happened in the past, and they can talk about it in its space in history. We don't have very much about that. And I totally agree with Edmund that a couple of talk show hosts will feature, but you know, it's that idea of having that that larger community in which the work takes place. It's not just about the writer or the actor or the theatre director producing the work. That's just the first step, the making of the work. Once the work is there, what do we do as a country to make sure it thrives and and that it continues to impact us? And you know, you've got Shakespeare all those years ago, and his work that have kind of spun out so much that has happened from that. I'd love to see a day where, you know, our own literature is spinning off ourselves from many years ago.
We'll
right?
do it again.
No, we shouldn't. I mean, I love you, Margaret. I'm not sure we should do Emily again, but we should be seeing work that spins off of Emily, right? That's referential to Emily, but that is new and it's different in itself. And we should have those sorts of cycles should start to take place. Where we start getting there, then I think our writing and our stories have kind of taken hold and keep growing. They've got more branches. It's not just a poor little single seedling. Yes, sort of each one on its own. It actually become a forest. Or
2 generations ago, we had people who were writing, but they wrote part-time. They had a full-time job, whether as a teacher, as a professor, as a lawyer, as a surgeon. They all had full-time jobs, and they were writing part-time. Nowadays, what you're having is you're having a lot of young people who want to write full-time, and they're taking part-time jobs in order to survive.
Right.
But they really want to
theatre.
write,
Yeah.
and they're doing full-time. They full-time writers, and they're writing novels, they're writing poetry, they're writing short stories. You know, and we have many full-time writers now, which you didn't have 30, 40 years ago. So I'm optimistic. I think the writing is much better.
Agree.
Yes, because
Right?
it's very
So
important.
much better.
They should be trained for it. I think
And
that
they're trained, and they're being encouraged by publishers in Singapore. And I think nothing's going to stop them.
I do remember doing theatre, and I've always said that we're so lucky we've got 5 in the audience, 4 of which got complimentary seats.
That's right.
And I really mean that. That's how we began theatre, because like Stage Club had the chokehold, and we were just sort of like struggling along. But look where are we now? And it still amazes me that while I go to theatre and see full houses.
And it's important that this continues,
Yes.
because you need local stories, so that you have stories that that people can bond around. You know, they can. I give you the example. It's just like Tom Sawyer. Right? Every American knows about the story of Tom Sawyer. Every American has read the story, because it's an old story, and everybody understands the value of Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn. That's why you need local stories. You need stories that will resonate with every Singaporean. You need a book that every Singaporean can resonate around. I think that Bali Kaur's book that we published called Sugar Bread. I've always said it's the Mockingbird of Singapore. It is a story of a young Sikh girl growing up in Singapore and having to face the racism that, you know, that
It's not-
inherent in Singapore.
it-
Like the art of Charlie Chan Hock Chye. It's travel.
But it's left wing.
No, it doesn't matter where it's.
No, so
You
I'm
will
asking, is it-
Bali
is it-
Kaur has written books that I've traveled. Ovidia has written, this Auntie Lee's detective stories. They're published in America. They're being sold in America. Shamini Flynn, Malaysian, but she's written books that are being sold. So. And Epigram Books, we have opened a London office, and we're now publishing Singapore stories in London.
Congratulations.
So I'm convinced it will sell. So you write a good book, it will sell.
Is there anything missing in our ecosystem since everything is selling well?
Now it'll just take time, that's all. But everybody else has to help. The Ministry of Education, press, the bookshops, everybody has to recognize the importance of Singapore stories, the importance of investing in it, the importance of supporting it, and it will happen. I'm optimistic that the people of Singapore will support Singapore stories.
Belief is the word.
They will. They will.